good example of this big consumption boom. The World Bank says that a middle-income country is one where a large number of its population earn the equivalent of $6,000 a year on a PPP basis. So on that basis, 68% of Russians are middle income. Compared to, say, Brazil, where there's only about 30%, China's only about 12%, and India's actually only about 3%. So 2/3 of Russians are middle income, which means they have the purchasing power to buy some of that stuff that I was talking about. The other thing about Russia, apart from the fact they've seen significant rises in their income over the last 10 years, is that they don't have any debt. The average mortgage in Russia is 130 euros. That's not 130,000 euros, that's 130 euros. Because in the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were all given their apartments or houses to live in. So there's very little mortgage debt in Russia. So they've got this high consumer mentality. And not surprisingly, retail sales in Moscow now exceed Paris and London, which is quite surprising. And the Russian retail market is already the size of Germany's, which is one of the largest retail markets in Europe. So I think that's just a good example of consumption, and the more consumption we start to see as these 2 billion new consumers come onto the market, I think the economy is going to certainly reflect some interesting stories. Urbanisation. Now we know in the Western world that urbanisation creates a lot of economic activity. It creates productivity, it takes people off the land and into industrialised jobs, into factories, into offices. And it adds actually about 20% a year to your GDP. By a process of urbanisation. Now this is happening throughout the emerging world. One of the things we know is that urban dwellers spend about 3.5 times more than rural dwellers. So that's good for consumption as well and other types of economic activity. So urbanisation, which is happening throughout China, throughout Asia, throughout Latin America, and throughout Eastern Europe, is a big part of the emerging market story. This photograph was taken by me, actually, in Sao Paulo. I was there earlier this year. Sao Paulo is one of my favorite cities. It's an urban jungle. I'm sure some of you have been there. It's the largest city in the southern hemisphere. It's about the 5th largest in the world. Population of about 22 million people, and about 6 million cars. So you spend a lot of time in the back of a taxi. Unless you're lucky enough to own a helicopter, and most of these buildings have a helipad on the top of them, so all the rich guys get around from building to building, and all you hear all day are these helicopters above you. Kind of different sort of future world. But I do want to talk about China in relation to this one issue, innovation. Not the issue that I think most people would associate China with. Most people regard China as just being very good at copying things and producing them at much lower labor costs. But I think that myth is going to have to change because China is going through a transformation. They're investing heavily in science and technology, in research and development, in clean technology, in high-value manufacturing, and they're actually turning many industries upside down by the new innovation that they're introducing. When you talk about demographics, you can't really go past India. You know, half of the Indian population is under 25 or less. So as the Western world or the developed world starts aging, these countries are going to propel their economic growth further and further ahead of us. And that picture, I think, just sums up the youth and the energy that comes out of a place like India. Africa's the same. There's about 500 million people in Africa of working age population. That's projected to increase to about 1 billion by 2040. So that's an extraordinary number of people, over 1 billion people of working age. That will make Africa certainly the largest country or continent in the world in terms of working age. Dependency ratios are falling in these countries. Fertility rates are rising, currently around 2.6 in India and increasing. So that will propel the growth of countries like India and Africa and even Brazil and others that have young emerging populations that are going to start having a big impact going forward. Next one is savings. We know that savings are important. We know the converse of that, which is debt. which is not good, we've discovered. So many of these countries have a very high savings culture. We know about the Asian saving culture. People save, half of their incomes. But also in countries like Brazil, which was a basket case in the 80s, with the hyperinflation, with the military dictatorships, with the Latin American debt crisis, the devaluation of their currencies. They went through a really difficult time. But of course, in introducing a whole lot of reforms, in starting to increase their savings culture, getting their economy back on track, they're now actually accumulating significant reserves. In fact, last week they announced a $66 billion stimulus package in Brazil because they wanted to speed up the process of infrastructure development, because one thing I know you all know is that in 4 years' time, Rio in 2016, they've got a big event that they've got to host, and they're now competing with what now has been regarded as the best ever Olympics event ever in London. So there's a lot of work going into that. And of course, the fact they can provide this stimulus because of their savings culture is really important. And it's the same in other places like Russia. Russia was always a sort of debt problem country. Not anymore. They're now accumulating international reserves. It gives them a great buffer to deal with problems that may come their way. They can stimulate their way out.